Now, I grew up in Butte, Nebraska, a town of 400 people. I had 24 kids in my high school class.
Tim Walz, the Democratic candidate for vice president, is a gun-owning, camouflage-wearing veteran who often cracks dad jokes on the campaign trail.
I'm not crying, you're crying, so...
While this might seem like standard fare for a politician trying to connect with rural voters, Walz's background adds a twist. Walz was born in the Midwestern state of Nebraska, a state that hasn't voted for a Democrat in a presidential election since 1964. Walz, with his rural white working-class background, was widely viewed as a way to balance the Democratic presidential ticket and appeal to a wider cross-section of voters. Kamala Harris, born in California, is the first Black and South Asian woman to lead a major party ticket. That's especially critical in the so-called blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that Harris and Walz need to win the election. To understand Walz, you have to understand his roots. He was born in West Point, Nebraska, and spent his childhood in Valentine. Population, 2,600. Not exactly known for its political heavy hitters. He says that's where he learned to be generous towards neighbors, compromise without compromising his values, and work for the common good.
The work that all of you are doing in Minnesota is to keep that curve as flat as possible.
We followed Tim's career, I guess, a little bit at a distance. We saw us when he ran for governor as well, and this step, we probably didn't see this one coming. I don't imagine anybody envisioned this kind of a future for him, but we're all happy for him.
Walz often talks about the values he learned growing up in small-town Nebraska. His mother, Darlene Walz, was a stay-at-home mom. His father, James Frederick Walz, a school superintendent and Korean War veteran, instilled in him a strong work ethic and a commitment to community. Tragedy struck when Walz was a teenager. His father's diagnosis with lung cancer prompted the family to move 100 miles north to be closer to relatives in the even smaller town of Butte.
You know, we had a grocery store. At one time there was a couple clothing stores. There was like a variety store. We had our own, K through 12 school. So it was a lot busier.
With its sparsely populated remote towns, Nebraska Panhandle area residents measure distance in time, not miles. Butte is a small enough place that everybody knows your name, and you can rely on your neighbors for help. It's this Nebraska nice that many believe shines through Walz's personality.
Or as he and I say, Tim Talk. Right, Scout?
Walz, who studied social science education at Chadron State College, would follow in his late father's footsteps after graduating. He became a high school teacher and football coach in nearby Alliance.
It's harder to win that state football championship than it was to become governor, so it's tough work.
Walz's simple and straightforward talk made analysts compare him to the neighbor you'd want to have beers and barbecue with. Mike Pankos did just that with Walz when they were neighbors in Alliance.
As a coach and as just a guy living across the street, he was always very relatable. If you make that, especially in a small town, they get raised up on a pedestal. People are depending on him. And one thing, Tim was always never really like that. He stayed down to earth.
Walz met his wife, Gwen, and they started their family there. He says living in those small towns shaped his belief in the importance of community and looking out for one another. He talks about those values on the campaign trail, hoping to connect with voters on a personal level. To appeal to folks in rural America, Walz often emphasizes his rural bona fides. He wears a camouflage baseball cap, a nod to the avid outdoorsman and hunter that he is. And he isn't shy about his love of guns.
First opener, and I'm like, I want to shoot.
Walz joined the National Guard at 17, serving for 24 years, a decision inspired by his father's military service. Walz played up his time in the military and familiarity with guns in his speech at the Democratic National Convention.
Look, I know guns. I'm a veteran. I'm a hunter. And I was a better shot than most Republicans in Congress, and I got the trophies to prove it. but I'm also a dad. I believe in the Second Amendment, but I also believe our first responsibility is to keep our kids safe.
Despite Walz's support of gun ownership, he has fallen from receiving an A rating from the NRA to an F, primarily because of his support for some gun safety measures. For some rural voters, Walz's military service and history of gun ownership does not mean he shares their same values.
Nah, he ain't close. He lying through his teeth. That's Second Amendment right. I ain't taking his guns away like they're trying to do us.
Walz also supports abortion rights, a position that puts him at odds with many in conservative Nebraska. Churches in many towns here have abortion tombstones, and the landscape is dotted with anti-abortion signs.
The most important issue for me has always been pro-life. Whoever is pro-life is who I vote for. He won't get my vote.
Even some members of Walz's extended family posed for a photo wearing Walz's for Trump t-shirts. The photo was reposted by former President Donald Trump on Truth Social. In Butte, Tim Walz's uncle says he plans to vote for his nephew, but worries that he's not prepared for the world stage.
Tim isn't going to be tough enough for Putin. Just, it concerns me. He'd be too kind. That's the way I feel about it.
Nebraskans who believe that Walz embodies the spirit of their home state see him as a decent, hardworking man who cares about his community.
When we fight,
when I see him on TV, he does not remind me of a politician. He reminds me of what would be my favorite teacher in school, because he's really invested in his community and his students, and he really has a high moral compass and good moral values.
I defend the Second Amendment.
I think there's a lot of conservative Republicans who see somebody like Tim Walz and they see their neighbor, they see their uncle, they see, somebody familiar to them.
Many of these folks are going to participate in agribusiness over their lifetimes that we need here in Minnesota.
But while many admire him, some of Walz's local supporters admit that his Nebraska roots may not be enough to sway voters in such a deeply conservative state.
Out here, everybody's got to work together to get stuff done. We don't buy in too heavily to a lot of the national political rhetoric. That said, it's a pretty red county.
In the end, whether Walz finds support among rural Americans might come down to two things. Is he a candidate who reflects their values?
Freedom to make your own healthcare decisions.
Or a politician too far out of step with their beliefs?
There's a lot of families who don't talk about politics very much because there's a lot of disagreements, and I think that there's a lot of people who are comforted by him, but that may not change the way they vote.